Today, the focus is on Sherlock's critique of Woolston and to some extent also of Collins, as revealed in the footnotes, where he refers to Collins' grounds and reasons and to Collins' scheme of literal prophecy considered. We saw last time how Thomas Woolston criticized the resurrection in his sixth discourse after having criticized various other miracles in the Gospels, and we looked very briefly at Zachary Pierce's short, sober rejoinder to Woolston. Today we're going to focus on a much more popular rejoinder and one written in a finer style and one that is more engaging, and namely the Trial of the Witnesses of the Resurrection of Jesus by Thomas Sherlock. Just to recap where we've been before, Thomas Woolston was a Cambridge scholar but lost his position in 1721. He began publishing works with a deistical flavor in 1725, and between 1727 and 29 he published 6 rather scandalous pieces in which he gave his invective full rein and attacked bishops and a literal understanding of the miracles of the Gospels with equal verve. In 1729 he was tried and convicted of blasphemy, a trial that split the Christian population, some of whom felt that he deserved what he had coming, and that others felt that this was not the proper way to deal with someone, even someone who was as uncouth as Thomas Woolston. The principal arguments that he makes are found in the sixth discourse. This is a resource that you should be able to find on the SDA library website. First, he argues Jesus did not rise at the time foretold. He said 3 days and 3 nights. It should have been 3 days, and it should have been 3 nights. Instead, it was a night, 1 full day and night, and the beginning of the next morning, and that's also 36 hours rather than 72. Since the seal was broken on the stone at the mouth of the tomb before the 3 days had elapsed, there's reason to expect that there was some kind of fraud. Since Jesus did not personally appear to the chief priests, he ought to. That also raises suspicion of fraud. And some of Jesus' disciples didn't recognize him even by the account in the Gospels. You'll notice something interesting about the way these objections are leveled. Woolston is operating on the assumption that, apart from the actual supernatural claims, the Gospels are giving us a faithful record of things as they really transpired. The conversation on the road to Emmaus is taken as if it had really supposed to have been reported in just that way and not invented long afterwards. There really was a seal on the tomb that is reported in Matthew. This is something that later writers would not grant so easily. Woolston's great antagonist, whom we'll be looking at today, was Thomas Sherlock. Sherlock had just been made Bishop of Bangor at the time that this happened, but he had already engaged in a bit of controversial writing. He had written something on the use and intent of prophecy. Not exactly a response to Collins, but sort of clearing up issues that Collins had raised. When he was appointed bishop, one of his first literary acts was to write the Trial of the Witnesses of the Resurrection. This was published early in 1729, just after Woolston's trial and conviction. That's a direct response to Woolston's sixth discourse. Also, it's a response to some arguments raised by Collins, and in the footnotes you'll see references to the grounds and reasons or the scheme of literal prophecy. Those are Collins's works, and so Collins is the other target in all of this. The general structure of this is that it's framed as a mock trial arising from a disagreement among some lawyers over the strength of Woolston's arguments. One of the lawyers in particular takes Woolston's side, thinks that Woolston's criticisms are unanswerable. Another one says, I couldn't disagree with you more, and one thing leads to another, and they decide to hold a mock trial on the issue. It is only a fictitious trial. It's not an actual account of an actual trial. Woolston's trial was real enough, but this record that we're being given in Sherlock is a literary invention of Sherlock's own. The parties, Mr. A as counsel for Woolston, A for atheism, Mr. B as counsel for the apostles, B for believer if you like, are set to argue over the question of whether the apostles gave false evidence regarding the resurrection. So this is not an argument of the general truth of Christianity, and that's why actually the judge reins in Mr. A after Mr. A seems to be going roundabout to criticize Christianity on the whole. He says, no, we have a narrower point in view here. The point is simply, Is this a matter of false testimony or not? Woolston's objections are argued separately. That is, Mr. A, as counsel for Woolston, is given the opportunity to set up pieces of his argument, and then Mr. B is given the possibility of responding to those pieces before he presents more of the argument. Then it's all summed up at the end by the judge, and they appeal to the jury for a verdict. So what's the case for the prosecution? Well, following both Woolston and Collins, he says the resurrection's been long talked of, and to the amazement of everyone who can think freely, notice that little reference to free thinking on which Collins had written a work, has been believed through all ages of the church. Astonishing. I wish that the books dispersed against Jesus by the ancient Jews had not been lost, for they would have given us a clear insight into this contrivance. This is a polite paraphrase of what Woolston has his rabbis say in the Sixth Discourse on page 4. The expectation of a coming Messiah arose around the time of Jesus' birth. That's one of Collins' favorite themes, and nothing is more natural and common to promote rebellions than to ground them on new prophecies or new interpretations of old ones. Again, this is coming from Collins, so there's a blend here of the positions of both of these people, and that blend is actually promised on the title page, where we're told that not only the objections of Mr. Woolston, but also those of several others will be considered. Jesus, however, decided to handle the issue differently. He wanted an earthly kingdom, but he decided that the best way to approach this would be by stealth. So he pretended that the sense of the prophecies was different from what they were actually taken to be, that they made the Messiah to be a suffering rather than a conquering prince, meek and lowly, hoping by this means that he could avoid attracting notice from the authorities until it was too late for them to stop him. He chose 12 men. Counsel for Woolston and Woolston himself both indicate that these were pretty dull fellows, men of low intellect, and left them partly in the dark about his reinterpretation of the prophecy, so that they actually quarreled about which one of them was going to be greatest when he became king. So these 12 chumps formed the core of his disciples. The Jewish people were superstitious, and therefore they were easily duped into the belief that Jesus had supernatural powers. This last point is something that's going to come up again, and so keep your eyes open, most notably in part 2 of David Hume's essay of miracles. The objection will arise that miracle stories flourish among the ignorant and the barbarous, and that as you move forward to more enlightened times, these miracle stories die off and are heard no more. People don't make pretensions like that in enlightened, educated nations. But the plan did not work, and Jesus realized that he was not going to be a king. He was instead going to be crucified. Unwilling that all the work he had done should go completely to waste, he spread a rumor regarding his resurrection. So the idea was that even if he died, that's okay. Maybe something could still survive from the ruins of this elaborate plot. According to Woolston and his counsel in Sherlock's narrative, a comparison of Jesus' predictions with the Jewish prophetical writings reveals that there were no such prophecies understood in this sense, so they were a sheer fabrication on the part of Jesus. Therefore, the early Christians had to promote a different understanding of the prophecies than they originally had according to the Jews. This, of course, is all from Collins, that the Christians had to beat into the Jews the interpretation the Christians preferred. At this point, counsel for the defense, Mr. B, is allowed to respond to the various things that Woolston's attorney has said, bringing it down to the death of Christ. The prosecution had wished that the books of the ancient Jews had survived because we might have a fuller picture of the Christian imposture. Well, you might well wish for that, because as matters stand, you have no evidence to support any part of your scheme. It's an entirely fictitious scheme, says the defense attorney. There's nothing amazing about the fact that a true report should be widely received. To say that this is amazing is an argument from the prosecutor's personal confidence that there was no resurrection. It's not an argument from evidence. So a psychological argument rather than one based on facts. That the resurrection is now believed by many who have not examined its evidence is not anything more than might be said of almost any truth in the world. Who has really examined the Newtonian scheme in Principia Mathematica? Only a few people of great learning have examined it, and yet many people accept that Newton has given us the true scheme of the world. How many people have examined even the earlier postulates in Euclid's Elements, and yet people accept them on credit? So the mere fact that it's been accepted can't be an argument against it. That's not a legitimate critique. The key question is this: how did the claim of the resurrection gain credit in the world at the first? Afterward, when Christianity is a movement, we might not place much weight on its acceptance. But at the beginning, when everything's against it, how did it gain credit then? The problem with Woolston's scheme here is that Jesus' actions and teachings defied all Jewish expectations. And then Sherlock has Mr. B enumerate these. They wanted a prince. Jesus told them they were all mistaken about this. They held sacred the traditions of their elders. He told them that those traditions undermined the law of God. They valued their Jewish identity. He told them that people would come from all quarters of the world, from the east and the west, and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom. The franchise is being extended. It's not simply a Jewish thing. They thought God should be worshipped only at Jerusalem. He told them God might and should be worshipped everywhere. You'll remember John 4 in the interview with the Samaritan woman at the well. They were superstitious in their observance of the Sabbath, but by their reckoning, he broke it frequently. The problem is that if Jesus' objective were to make use of Jewish prejudices, then he did it all wrong. At every point, instead of cozying up to them, he's putting a finger in their eye and saying, no, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. This sort of picture of the way that early Christianity was set up will come back again in the early pages of Paley's view of the evidences of Christianity. So if you are, for any reason, whether for your paper or just out of personal interest, reading Paley, who is a later 18th century source, then keep in mind this little list of things from Sherlock. Paley will make a very similar case. The objection, according to Woolston, is that Jesus did all of these things deliberately. Okay, if he did them deliberately, then he had a motive, some objective that he was aiming for that would explain his conduct. The trouble is, the motive offered is completely incompatible with the method used. The motive, according to counsel for Woolston, and according to Woolston himself, is that Jesus wanted an earthly kingdom, and he wanted to pick up on the prophecies and the prejudices of the Jews in order to make them follow him. Unfortunately, what he did is exactly the opposite. It's like saying that a concert pianist wanted to improve his dexterity by sticking his hand into a fan. You don't break your fingers to improve your dexterity. That's worse than useless as an explanation. It points in exactly the opposite direction. You can't explain certain facts by a hypothesis that makes them ridiculously improbable, particularly when there's an alternative hypothesis on hand that does not do that. Moreover, waiving all of that, if Jesus had really been aiming at an earthly kingdom, he had his chance when he entered Jerusalem. Crowds were strewing palm branches before him, crying, Hosanna, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. That was the moment. He was in Jerusalem, the crowd was with him, they could have risen up and in one popular rebellion at that point swept him into the throne. But he didn't do it. Again, later writers will question the veracity of the gospel accounts. Later writers will pick and choose and try to take apart the gospel accounts, using only parts of them that they wish to use and dismissing other parts as inauthentic. So the ground does change somewhat in some later debates. Here, the ground being taken by Woolston is the same as the ground being taken by Pearce and by Sherlock as they critique him. So they're free. If Woolston takes this for granted, then they are free to do so as well. There was a Christian kingdom. That would be the empire after the conversion of Constantine, but that happens in the 4th century. So that can't have been the objective at which Jesus aimed. Moreover, Jesus can't have aimed sort of vaguely at a coming kingdom, because if he had, then he ought to have prophesied that they would keep his commandments faithfully and never alter them. But there's nothing more common on the lips of both Jesus and his followers than the warning that Christian teaching will be perverted, that people will not follow it, and that false teachers will arise. So that can't even have been a vaguely discerned motive that just happened not to come of fulfillment until the 4th century. That just doesn't make any sense. Again, it doesn't fit with the actual content of what we read in the New Testament. There's a curious point, just in passing. Sherlock anticipates something that would become more popular and in the late 18th and early 19th century, namely the Swoon theory. So Mr. B says, "My lord, I desire to know whether the gentleman charges any fraud on this part of the history. Perhaps he may be of opinion by and by that there was a sleight of hand in the crucifixion, and that Jesus only counterfeited death. He only pretended to die." Venturini was one of the people who took this point of view. There were several others who took this point of view. Voici, later in the 19th century, some of the crazier folk in the early 19th century, mentioned by Thomas Cooper in his Bridge of History. So there were people who took these radical views. They keep coming around, though. In fact, there's an essay, if you want to look this up, called On Reissuing Venturini. It's in Collins and Kendall's Focus on Jesus. In this essay, they describe the way that all the way up to Hugh Schoenfield's Passover plot, this idea of a swoon keeps resurfacing. People seem unable to leave it alone. But Woolston isn't going to argue that, and neither is Mr. A in Sherlock's dialogue. So now we come to the heart of Woolston's hypothesis. This is very difficult to credit that anyone would actually have taken seriously, and yet here's Woolston writing about it vigorously. He says the priests had discovered fraud in the supposed resurrection of Lazarus, and they wanted to prevent another such fraud. So here's what happened. The chief priests on the one side and the apostles on the other entered into a pact to determine whether Jesus would still be dead 3 days after his crucifixion. That's the reason that the tomb was sealed, to make sure that it was not opened before the appointed time. So that, says Woolston, is the reason that they put a seal on the tomb. However, the seals were broken before the time set, which should have been 3 full days after the burial. And Jesus' disciples and the chief priests should both have come to see the opening of the tomb to verify whether the body was indeed inside or not. But the seals were broken before the appointed time. That gives a strong presumption that the disciples had come and stolen away the body. I know some of you are looking at this and thinking, how could anyone really cook this up and present it seriously? But Woolston presented it. Whether seriously or not, I leave you to judge. Here's how Sherlock goes about confuting this hypothesis. First, why should the priests take any interest in what happened to the body unless they had reason to be uneasy regarding his prophecy? So Mr. B says if they were uneasy because they had already heard of Jesus' wonders, and they were worried that maybe even the helpless dead man might rise again. I think this is probably one of the weaker parts of Mr. B's argument, because I think that it could be rejoined. They were worried that the disciples might steal it, even though that was a misjudgment of the disciples' psychological state. That still, their stated reason was their real reason. Second point, there is not the slightest evidence that anyone had discovered fraud in the case of Lazarus. If you read John 11 and even into John 12, verses 10 and 11, the most that happens is that people who are in charge, the Jewish rulers, are upset by the fact that there's a report of Lazarus' resurrection, and they conspire together to kill him again, and this time make it permanent. Woolston's hypothesis that the disciples entered into agreement with the chief priests is preposterous. They were hiding in fear of their lives, as was only natural. This is complete fabrication, and fabrication in the face of everything that we know about human nature. As he puts it, can any man now in his right senses think that the disciples under these circumstances entered into this covenant with the Jews? Why would anyone do that? Why would anyone believe the claim that they had done that? That is an absurdity. But he goes on. According to Woolston's hypothesis, the guards themselves gave testimony that the disciples sold the body while they slept. Well, says Mr. B, how'd the guards know what happened while they were sleeping? If by their own testimony they were asleep, then by their own testimony they saw no one and knew nothing of what had happened. But waive that. What motive could they have had for stealing a dead body? What good could a dead body do them? Really? They thought that if they just said the tomb was empty and we saw him rise, that would all by itself start a new movement? Crazy. The principal thing they stood to gain if they tried that course of action was that they would draw attention back to themselves and be crucified. That's not a motive. That's a disincentive. Antonin Scalia, the U.S. Supreme Court Justice, in a public talk given about 20 years ago, said, talked about this, and he said, so what's the hypothesis? That the story of the resurrection was a clever ruse that the apostles had worked up in order to ensure that they would all be killed in some grisly fashion? Is that really the hypothesis? And so Scalia, who is an eminent jurist, is taking the part here of Sherlock's counsel, Mr. B, and saying that's just not credible. Give me a different explanation. That one's not going to do. What means could they have had? Moving a dead body requires many men. You've got to roll away that stone, break those seals, and carry it out of the grave. Moreover, you're carrying it out of the grave during Passover, when Jerusalem is thronged with hundreds of thousands of additional pilgrims from all around the empire. Where are you going to go with that? How are you going to avoid being seen? And how are you going to do it so quietly that even if the guards happen to have dozed off, they're not going to wake back up when they hear the stone grinding and men grunting as they're carrying a full-grown man's body out? Not credible. So means and motive, no. Moreover, look at the change that's required here in the conduct of the apostles. At first, Woolston has described them, and Sherlock's Mr. A has described them, as simpletons. So foolish, so unlearned, that they are complete dupes and easily swayed by anything Jesus says. Now, suddenly, they're bold and cunning con men, slipping a body out of a tomb and trying to pull off the biggest con of all time. What made that change happen? Again, if Jesus rose from the tomb in even approximately the manner the Gospels relate, then the seal on the tomb must have been broken, and here Sherlock makes a very interesting methodological point. It is surprising to hear these circumstances made use of to prove the resurrection to be a fraud, which yet could not but happen, supposing the resurrection to be true. I put a little extra question into the reading questions for Sherlock that you've already turned in, only for those of you who have some probability theory already and wanted to look at that. So let's just take very briefly a look at how this breaks down. I'll call it Sherlock's Theorem. Let E be the evidence that the seals on the tomb were broken. Let R be the claim that the resurrection took place in even approximately the way described in the Gospels. And let not R be the denial of that, the claim that the resurrection did not take place in even approximately that fashion. Well, the probability of E given R is pretty much 1. The stone was rolled away, the tomb was open, the seals would have to be broken for that to be the case. But now it's a simple theorem of probability that E is evidence against R if and only if the probability of E given R is less than the probability of E given not R, and it's significant evidence against R only if it's much less than the probability of E given not R. But no probability can be greater than 1, and if the probability of E given R is already 1, then that inequality could at most be trivially greater on the right-hand side than on the left. And in fact, plainly, it's not even close to that maximum. So the evidence actually points the other direction. Conclusion, E cannot, even in the worst case scenario, significantly favor not R. And in the actual circumstances, it must in fact favor R. That's a really interesting way of arguing. So remember that bit regarding the probability of E given R being close to 1. If you do probability, this is a theorem that's worth keeping in your back pocket and having on hand. It will come up again in other places. There will be other times when we will see this kind of reasoning invoked. One example of that will come up when we're looking at Hume's attack on miracles. And so let me just put this verbally, and then later we'll go into it in more detail as we're reading Hume. Hume maintains that having seen that people don't come back to life over and over again, we have a massive argument, indeed one than which no argument from experience can possibly be greater, against a particular claim of a resurrection. Set aside the fact that that's an inductive argument and that in the very same book where he argues against miracles, Hume has a critique of inductive reasoning as not rationally grounded. But let that go. Think about what's being said. There's a uniform course of nature in which dead men stay dead. Hume's opponents immediately seized upon this. William Adams says, miracle and an ordinary course of nature are correlative notions like a mountain and a valley. You can't have the one without the other. A stream has to flow in order for it to make any sense to say that its course has been diverted. You cannot have a miracle serving as a sign, unless we already know that it's not the sort of thing that would naturally have happened in the ordinary course of events. So, in order for there to be a miracle, there must be a robust set of evidence that this is not the way nature behaves by itself. But in that case, the probability that there will be lots of uniform experience of dead men staying dead is close to 1, even if there has been, in one particular case, a miracle serving as a sign. And therefore, the fact that there is this established course of nature cannot be used as evidence, certainly not as strong evidence, against the claim that rarely and occasionally there have been things that nature alone could not do. So Sherlock's theorem will come up again with respect to Hume. Sherlock's theorem, that's my own coinage. You won't find it called Sherlock's theorem anywhere else in the literature. But I was so taken with the fact that Sherlock had this little probabilistic nugget there that I thought it deserved the name. So if one of you wants to become famous by calling it Sherlock's theorem, just give me a footnote. Woolston had objected regarding 3 days. You'll remember that Peirce gave a discussion of that, and if you looked at that very brief first part of Peirce's work, you'll see just a calm and complete refutation, appealing to Jewish interpreters, appealing to Porphyry, who is a heathen, and appealing to the book of Esther in chapters 4 and 5, where we find that Esther is going to fast 3 days and nights, and yet on the 3rd day there she is at a feast, obviously partaking of the banquet. So the phrase 3 days and nights is to be taken in the typical Jewish way, and a way of many others, as counting parts of days as days. But again, if there had been some hanky-panky because the tomb was opened early and the priests believed the disciples had stolen the body, why in the book of Acts did they try to do everything except accuse them of stealing the body? They try to beat them, they try to kill them, they never charge them with theft. Why is that? Again, remember that Woolston is assuming that the non-miraculous parts of the narrative can be taken at face value. Parts that presuppose or narrate a miracle are a different matter. But on those grounds, Woolston's own hypothesis just doesn't make any sense. Gamaliel gives this speech in Acts 5, why doesn't he even mention the accusation that they stole the body, if that's what he really means, if that's what he's really doing? How about Woolston's objection to Jesus' post-mortem appearances? Well, according to Peter in Acts chapter 10, Jesus appeared only to chosen witnesses. Counsel for Woolston, Mr. A, brings that up, and he says this circumstances raises suspicion. If he was really risen, why didn't he appear to people other than chosen witnesses? Particularly, why didn't he appear to the chief priests and the rulers? He was claiming to be the Messiah. His resurrection, he had claimed, would be the clinching credential. So why doesn't he show up and demonstrate who he is? You'll remember Pierce's objection to this line of reasoning. His rejoinder was to say, suppose that he had, and suppose the whole Jewish nation had converted on the spot. That would have only given grounds for saying that the whole thing was a national Jewish fraud. And once you invoke the chief priests and the rulers, it's very difficult then to see why they should not be able to put across a fraud on a large scale. But a handful of largely uneducated fishermen are not the men to put forward a fraud and make it stick with the entire nation. So that was Pierce's response. Sherlock goes somewhere else with it. Again, counsel for Woolston, and compare this to something that Hume says in Of Miracles Part 2. The evidence of the poor silly women is dubious because it's grounded in their superstition, ignorance, and fear. Every country can afford 100 instances of this kind, and there is common to them all, that as learning and common sense prevail in any country, they die away and are no more heard of. Now, that's a very curious claim for anyone to be making, and there's a bit of byplay that may have passed you by if you didn't have the appropriate background on this, and that is there was a reference to some French prophets, and I think Mr. B raises this back real early. He says, the instance of Dr. M's is so far to the purpose that it shows to what lengths enthusiasm will carry men, and why might not the same thing happen at Jerusalem, which happened but a few years ago in our own country. Matthew and John and the rest of them managed that affair with more dexterity than the French prophets. Okay, who are these French prophets? Well, there were 3 camisards who came over from France. The French didn't want them, who pretended to having special revelations and prophecies. Marion, Cavalier, and Faga were their names. And in 1707, 1708, they persuaded some people, including one British minor noble, John Lacy, that they were receiving real revelations from God. And in fact, a member of their group, Dr. Thomas Ems, died and was buried in Bunhill Fields. And they prophesied that on a stated day in May of the next year, Dr. Ems would rise bodily out of his grave, and he would say a few suitable and pious words to the assembled multitudes. And so this prophecy was published in broadsheets, and a very large crowd of very rowdy Englishmen showed up at Bunhill Fields. They were not expecting the resurrection of Dr. Thomas Ems. They were not in a mood to be passive watchers, and the result was that Mr. Lacy and the others had to run away, and needless to say, Dr. Thomas Ems did not rise from the dead. Lacy later published a broadsheet saying that it was because of the lack of faith of the people who showed up that Dr. Ems was not raised from the dead, and if they had showed up in a more docile and believing spirit, then it would have happened. Lacy later ran off, leaving his wife to run off with one of the prophetesses, and was never heard from again. That's a funny episode, but that's what's going on in that little bit of byplay. The relevance of that to this point is very simple. This was in 1708. Hume was born in 1711. Woolston was a full-grown man in 1708. The suggestion that pretensions to miracles don't happen in educated populations where learning and common sense prevail tells against the English in this case, and that wasn't the idea. The idea was that the English were the pinnacle of common sense. Indeed, the English seem to think that they invented common sense, and since that time, none but the English have had it. But in this case, the example of Dr. M's rather tells against them. There's a long quotation I'm going to give you from Mr. A, the skeptic, and I want you to think of Hume as well. Many of you have read Hume. If you haven't, go ahead, skip ahead and read Hume. Although in common life we act in 1,000 times on the faith and credit of human testimony, yet the reason for so doing is not the same in the case before us. In common affairs, where nothing is asserted but what is probable and possible, and according to the usual course of nature, a reasonable degree of evidence ought to determine every man, for the very probability or possibility of the thing is a support to the evidence. And in such cases, we have no doubt but a man's senses qualify him to be a witness. But when the thing testified is contrary to the order of nature, and at first sight at least impossible, what evidence can be sufficient to overturn the constant evidence of nature which she gives us in the uniform and regular method of her operations? So, a restriction on testimony. In ordinary life, we take even slight testimony from people we don't even know well to be adequate to ground our opinions. If somebody I've never met before tells me there's been an accident on the local highway, I'm not likely to raise any objection, because accidents do, after all, happen from time to time. It's not that improbable. But when something is contrary to the order of nature, what evidence can be sufficient to overturn the constant evidence of nature? That is Hume's argument from part 1 of Miracles in a nutshell. I've already pointed some of you to a sermon of Robert South, written probably before Hume's birth, certainly before he was even a teenager, since South died when Hume was 5. This line of reasoning had been anticipated, and it's interesting how it keeps coming up again and again and again. Sherlock's rejoinder is very shrewd. He has Mr. B responds that Mr. A began with complaining that Christ did not appear publicly to the Jews after his resurrection, and especially to chief priests and rulers, but he concluded with an observation to prove that no evidence in this case can be sufficient. That a resurrection is a thing in nature impossible, at least impossible, to be proved to the satisfaction of a rational inquirer. If this be the case, why does he require more evidence, since none can be sufficient? What Mr. A just brought forward would have been a complete objection against any proof being admitted, any evidence being admitted at all. But in that case, why is he complaining that there's not more evidence? He would dismiss more evidence as well. There is a similar complaint that gets leveled against the two different parts of Hume's essay of Miracles. Against the first part, the objection is that it would rule all evidence in the case out of court. And then along comes the second part, and Hume is arguing that the evidence isn't really all that strong for particular miracle claims. Well, why do you even need to do that if the argument of part 1 does the job? The two pieces seem to fit together oddly, and people complain about that. You'll find the Oxford logician Richard Whately complaining of this in his annotations to an edition of Paley's Evidences. On Mr. B's principles, on Mr. A's principles, that should be. A man who lives in a warm climate and never saw ice ought on no evidence to believe that rivers freeze and grow hard in cold countries, for this is improbable, contrary to the usual course of nature, and impossible according to his notion of things. And yet we all know that this is a plain manifest case, discernible by the senses of men, of which, therefore, they are qualified to be good witnesses. So what's the objection here? The objection is, if we were to take these skeptical principles that when a thing is contrary to the course of nature, then we can't admit evidence of it. Well, someone who's lived in Sumatra all his life has never seen water in a frozen state. And why then should he accept testimony if no testimony can be accepted for things that are contrary to the usual course of nature? His concept of the course of nature is a concept in which there's no room for hard water. That's a contradiction in terms given his experience, supposing that the skeptical principles here of Mr. Woolston are taken seriously. But in that case, why accept the testimony? and yet we all know that we should. There's an interesting historical riff on this. If you move forward to the early 19th century, the 1800s, the Marquis de Laplace, Pierre Simon Marquis de Laplace, was a very famous scientist wielding a great deal of power in France. Laplace held that it was absurd for museums to collect certain rocks and claim that they had fallen from the sky. Rocks do not fall from the sky, no matter what the peasants might say. Rocks don't fall from a clear sky. The course of nature is against it. We know of no mechanism that would bring it about, and therefore he convinced many French museums to throw out their meteorite collections. Over the protests of those who said, but we have multiple witnesses that these things came down out of the sky. This is not something that we're simply making up. The testimony of these people shouldn't be brushed aside. Laplace, on Humean principles, did brush it aside, and it was, of course, only a bit later that Laplace's views on the matter were decisively overturned, and yet he's being a good Humean, and he's following this skeptical principle that's being put forward by counsel for Woolston in this case. Something that Mr. B says is quite interesting. He says it is natural for a stone to roll downhill. It's unnatural for it to roll uphill. But a stone moving uphill is as much the object of sense as a stone moving downhill. And all men in their senses are as capable of seeing and judging and reporting the fact in one case as in the other. We don't expect a stone to roll up a hill. We expect it to roll down instead. But if a stone did roll up a hill, our eyes are perfectly competent to see it rolling up the hill. This is not something that is out of the reach of the senses. This is not like something so small as to be invisible to the naked eye. This is a matter that lies within our senses. Well, so do dead men, and so do living, breathing, conversing, eating, walking men. Those are things that lie within our senses as well. There is, therefore, no reason to say this is something where the evidence of testimony as to our senses cannot be admitted. A resurrection, considered only as a fact to be proved by the evidence, is a plain case. It requires no greater ability in the witnesses than that they be able to distinguish between a man dead and a man alive, a point in which I believe every man living thinks himself a judge. Very important passage there. If you didn't make a special note of it as you were reading, maybe you should go back and do that. And there's a really interesting little tag left onto this. Mr. B says, I do allow that this case and others of like nature require more evidence to give them credit than ordinary cases do. You may therefore require more evidence in these than in other cases, but it is absurd to say that such cases admit no evidence when the things in question are manifestly objects of sense. The reason that this comment is interesting is that there are some recent interpreters of Hume, Vogelin is an example in his book A Defense of Hume on Miracles, who maintain that Hume introduced what Vogelin calls the reverse method of judging the credibility of a testimonial report. The direct method is that you look at the credibility of the testifier. The reverse method is that you look at the dubiousness of the thing testified. But Sherlock here, writing when Hume was just a teenager, clearly articulates that there can be some relevance of the testimony, of the incredibility of the event to the testimony. You may require more evidence for this. What you cannot rationally do is put it beyond the reach of evidence, say that such cases admit no evidence. So that's a methodological point of considerable importance, and will become very important, of course, when we come to Hume. So notice how Sherlock's work, published when Hume was a teenager, when at best he was first beginning to have thoughts about these issues, frames some of the issues and even offers objections to the line that Hume will be taking. This is where the literature begins to be integrated in a very dense way. A couple of stray points here at the end. I wanted to just mention the Nazareth Inscription. This is a marble slab shipped from Nazareth. It's now in Paris in a museum. It is a translation into Greek, very wooden Greek. Looks like a translation into Greek from Latin that looks like a summary of an imperial rescript, and something the emperor would have written back in answer to a question. Here's how it reads. Edict of Caesar. Whoever has in any manner extracted those who have been buried, or who has moved with wicked intent those who have been buried in other places, committing a crime against them, or has moved sepulchre-sealing stones, I wish that violator, to suffer capital punishment under the title of tomb breaker. Epigraphically, in terms of the form of the handwriting in the inscription, this has been dated to the first half of the 1st century. Indeed, some people have localized it toward the end of that first half, which would put it in the time of the Emperor Claudius. Suetonius, the Roman historian, tells us that Claudius expelled all of the Jews from the Jewish quarter in Rome because they were rioting, and what they were rioting about was one Chrestus, which some people claimed had come back from the dead. If that is the occasion of it, and we have no other better, more plausible hypothesis, then this may be the imperial response to claims of the Jews that Jesus' disciples had robbed the tomb. The punishment of capital punishment for breaking a tomb is much more severe than we see in any similar case for at least 100 years. So the severity of this is out of place with the remainder of Roman law here, actually saying, crucify this person under the title, that is, with the accusation put above his head, of tomb breaker. A curious piece, I don't want to place too much emphasis on it, but it is an interesting piece of hard evidence that has some bearing on the historical, factual issues. So what's the significance of Sherlock's trial? Just a few points. First of all, it was wildly popular. It went through so many editions that some modern scholars have been even uncertain whether it was first published in 1728 or 1729. My research has nailed that down. It was very early 1729, but it's so popular people have been in doubt because it went through so many editions in its first year. It elicited a direct response from a skeptic we're going to be looking at later in the course, Peter Annett, that challenged and changed the terms of the debate. Unlike Woolston, Annett is going to call into question the trustworthiness of the Gospels themselves. So the narratives are no longer going to be taken, at least in their non-miraculous portion, as points of departure for everyone. Instead, Annett is going to challenge that, and then the response will have to take a different form of addressing his challenges to the credibility of the narratives. It was published when Hume was about 17, may have been on his mind as he wrote his essay of Miracles, which was published in 1748, but most commentators agree that Hume had written the essay earlier, maybe much earlier, and that's part of the reason that it sort of fits oddly with other pieces in his philosophical essays of 1748.